Good. Well, good morning. I maybe should have said good rainy Sunday morning. Torrential downpour out there for us this morning. We are in Joshua chapter 8 this morning. Abigail, would you please? My normal helper is on the way. Abigail's doing the handouts. If you're watching online, we do have this handout available up there as well. Last week, we finished up Joshua chapter 7, which had to do with the sad episode of Achan and his sin and the price that cost him, his family, and in fact the nation. And so today we are back in Joshua, starting with verse 1 of chapter 8. And this is the account of the actual conquest of the city of Ai. This section is one that I really have enjoyed because it just has a ton of description if you pay attention to the geography. And it's really fun to see how that plays out on the ground, on location there at Ai. And so I'm going to be spending a little time with you. It's kind of for me, it's kind of like having dessert because you don't get this in every section. So I enjoy it, and hopefully you won't be too bored. Your handout has a map on one side, and then on the back, a list of geographic details that I'm going to try and make sure I tell you what all the fill in the blanks are there. Hopefully you'll be able to pick that up fairly easily. Okay, so Joshua chapter 8, and I want to cover the first couple of verses before I jump into some of the geography here. Joshua 8 and chapter 8 and verse 1. Now the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear or be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you, and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. And you shall do to Ai and its king, just as you did to Jericho and its king. You shall take only its spoil and its cattle as plunder for yourselves." And then he finishes up by saying, "Set an ambush for the city behind it." So, they're done with purging sin from the camp, i.e. Achan, and now God says, okay, go up and take Ai. Did you notice a couple of things he told them there? Destroy the city, just like you did Jericho, but there's a difference. You can keep the stuff. You can take the spoil for yourselves. If only Achan had been willing to wait for that, instead of taking it from God's portion, which was Jericho. And then he specifically tells Joshua, set an ambush for the city. That's a tactical thing. Let me, my first slide is like zoomed in on the site, and I realized after I'd put this together that I didn't give you more of a backed out bird's eye view. So let me start with this map, hopefully just to orient you a bit. They're based at Gilgal, which is somewhere east of Jericho. We don't know exactly where Gilgal was, but east of Jericho out there on the plain. They're 12 or 13 miles up into the hill country to the west to get to Ai. Hopefully you can make that out there, and it's similar to what you have on your handout, the map you have there. So that's the area that I'm going to zoom in on, okay, the area there by Ai. The modern name for this ruin, Hirbit, means ruin, And the site is known as El Macader, but I'll most often just call it I. It's the only site that we have found in that area that even comes close to being the true identification of I, and the geography, as you'll see here, fits really nicely. So this is off Google Earth, and up is north. You know, you can turn Google Earth however you want it. But in this case, up is north. And you can see off to the west is this deep ravine that the modern name is Wadi Shaban. And that's where the ambushers they'll come up that wadi out of sight of the city and hide on the western side there. Let's see. The fact that this ambush is set behind the city means what? What would the front of the city be? The gate, yes. Yes. The gate is the front of the city. Most ancient cities, unless they were really large, had a single gate, just one. It's rare for them to have multiple gates. And so the front of the city is on the northern side. And so behind the city, well, the exact opposite would be to the south, but the text specifically tells us several times, set the ambush on the west side of the city, and they considered that behind the city because it's not in front of the city. Okay. By the way, the depth of this ravine from the ridge on the lip of it down to the bottom is about 300 feet. So it's quite a ways down. It's not a shallow little valley. Let me just run you through your fill in the blank stuff on the back. We're jumping around a little bit. Out of verse 9, we discover that the ambush place was between Bethel and Ai. So it's between those two locations. I'm going to switch views here for you. So you can see here, this is the Wadi Shaban. We're looking toward the west. Here's Ai. Bethel is off to the west. And so their hiding ambush place is, in fact, between those two sites. It fits perfectly. Also in verse 9, we read that the ambush place was on the west side of Ai. That's pretty specific. And in fact, there's not an alternative, really. There's no other place where you could set an ambush around either this side or any of the others in that area. Jumping down to verse 11, the front of Ai was on the north side. Let me just read that to you. Joshua, in the middle of the verse, camped on the north side of Ai, and there was a valley between him and Ai. And I skipped the earlier part. He arrived in front of the city, camped on the north side. There was a valley between. And so the valley between, I've got that on there for you, don't I? Yes. The second 8:11 there. Joshua camped on the north side of Ai across a valley from the city. So let me switch. Well, you can kind of make that out. The ideal thing here would be to actually have Google Earth up here for you live and actually move it around, because then the terrain is much easier to see. I did throw a line across here, and can you tell it dips a little bit in there? That dip is about 100 feet drop in elevation, but it's a fairly shallow valley. So it's definitely a valley. And so that's where Joshua camped, on this ridge here. And here's Ai, and then the ambushers were back here. let's see. Joshua's main force in verse 15 was able to flee toward the way of the wilderness and the camp at Jericho, which was to the east. Let me throw that map back up here. So when they feigned retreat, they were headed east toward their home base, which was Jericho. And that is a natural way for them to run. The couple of maps I've got here for you are not going to show that the most effectively. Let me show you this. Go back, you've seen this slide. You see the two modern roads that run up on either side of I. Modern roads in this area follow the ancient roads. In Nebraska, it's irrelevant. Everything's flat. You can put a road wherever you want, right? Maybe a river crossing or a ford. That's why we have them laid out on miles. Every mile there's a road, because you can put it wherever you want, so why not make it even? Here, you can't do that unless you're going to put a ton of construction money in to cut through mountains and over valleys, and that's a waste if you can just follow the ridge. It's more like what they do down in the Ozarks. The roads are like this because they're following a ridge or following a valley, that kind of thing. So from Joshua's camp here, in fact, you can follow the ridge along this modern road. There's a direct route down toward Jericho. So it's completely natural that from that place they would flee eastward toward Jericho. This is looking west. So north is to your right and south to your left. And east is toward the viewer. Yes. I'm standing in Jericho. Okay. Let's see. Chapter 8 and verse 19, it's implied that the main Israelite force could be seen by the ambushers. I'm going to come back to that one. Explain that in a little more detail after a bit. Verse 28, what word did I want in there? Oh yeah, they burned the city of Ai. That's unique. You recollect that's only said of 3 cities in the entire conquest narrative: Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. Only those 3. And so we would expect to find, if we've located Ai correctly, we would expect to find evidence of that. And finally, verse 29 tells us that Ai had a city gate, which also implies a city wall, right? So it's a fortified site. Easy to pass over that kind of thing, but it's significant. It wasn't just a little village. There were lots of little villages out there, but this is one that was fortified. It had a gate, and there's no point in having a gate if you don't have a wall, right? Okay. I think I've given you all the words to fill in there. I'm ready for verse 3. So Joshua rose with all the people of war to go up to Ai. And Joshua chose 30,000 men, valiant warriors, and sent them out by night. He commanded them, saying, "See, you're going to ambush the city from behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready." So they're fairly near proximity. "Then I and the people who are with me will approach the city, and it will come about when they come out to meet us as at the first, that we will flee before them. And they will come out after us until we've drawn them away from the city. For they will say, 'They're fleeing before us as at the first.' So we will flee before them. And you will rise up from your ambush and take possession of the city, for the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand. Then it will be, when you have seized the city, that you shall set the city on fire. You shall do it according to the word of the Lord. See, I have commanded you. So Joshua sent them away, and they went to the place of ambush, and remained between Bethel and Ai, on the west side of Ai. But Joshua spent that night among the people. A couple of things I want to point out here. The group size here, 30,000. Do you recollect how many went up the first time? Yeah, 2,000 or 3,000 was what the spies recommended. So they have sent up a force 10 times as large, right? Interesting fact here, if you jump ahead to verse 12, it clarifies for us that Joshua actually had about 5,000 in the ambush. So, working in reverse, it seems to me that the 30,000 here is the entire force, not just the ambush force. You wouldn't know that just reading here in verse 3, because your initial thought would be, oh, well, just the ambush force is that many. But I think verse 12 clarifies that. And so the rest of them would have been his main party. They were sent out at night, hopefully with a full moon, right? I don't know if you've ever hiked at night, but if it's really dark, it's hard to see, even when you've got a decent road. Text doesn't say that the moon was out, but for their sake, I'm hoping it was, or that they had cat eyes. They're in the spring. The closest calendar date we have was with the crossing of the Jordan, which was in the first month. So we're probably April, maybe May. We don't know exactly how much time has passed here, but it doesn't seem like much. So I would say middle of spring. May is probably as good a guess as anything. So yeah, the terrain will be green as it's going to get. But it's warm out too. We already talked about the ambush from behind the city and its location there. Let me just throw up an aerial view. This shows you a little better than Google Earth the deepness of the terrain. That wadi is just a Arabic term for a dry riverbed. It's dry most of the year. What would we use, an REO or something like that? About 300 feet deep. And then you can see Ai off to the east there. We're looking from the north here. A somewhat similar picture here from a little further to the west. But it's a significant gorge that these guys were able to work their way up, out of sight of the Israelites. Another interesting thing here I'll mention in passing, because it may come up again later on, is that today there's almost no trees in this region. In antiquity, from what we understand, there's a couple indications in the book of Joshua that this area was pretty heavily forested. Today, it would be real easy to stand up on the edge there and watch a couple thousand people coming up this ravine. If it was heavily forested, that would be completely different. So I think we at least have to hold that out as a possibility. And that would have just enhanced their ability to sneak up there much more easily. Yeah, we'll come back to setting the city on fire as well. Pretty detailed information that Joshua gives them on where to set this ambush. And it's interesting that the fact that there is an ambush is mentioned 3 different times. Verses 3 and 4, well, not to mention 2, where God said to set an ambush. Verse 9, verse 12. So this is an important part to the narrator. There's an ambush. They're gonna take these guys from behind. It's a surprise event. Okay, Joshua chapter 8 and verse 10. Now Joshua rose early in the morning and mustered the people, and he went up with the elders of Israel before the people of Ai. Then all the people of war who were with him went up and drew near and arrived in front of the city and camped on the north side of Ai. Now there was a valley between him and Ai. And he took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush. He's already told us then, this is repeat. Set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the city. Very specific stuff. Joshua and the main camp are north of the city with a valley in between. The ambushers are on the west side of the city, out of sight, and the only logical place they could be is in a dip because there are no mountains around that you could hide behind. So they've got to be in a dip, a gorge. Just for kicks, this is looking up from the area of Jericho toward Ai, a shot out of an airplane, and you can see the ascent of Zeboim, which follows the valley of Zeboim as they go up. It's about 12, 13 miles. Map, we already looked at this. So Joshua apparently spent the night down in Jericho, and then in the day took the main force. Hey, we're here. And traveled up and camped across from the city. Looking off toward the east from the area of Makadar. Let's see here. I don't know how many of these things you're interested in seeing. I could spend all day scoping this stuff out. This is from the north, looking down toward Wadi Shaban. You can see Ai off to the on the left side there, Bethel on the right. One more picture of the Wadi Shaban where the ambush force came up. Okay, so Joshua and the main force marched up the ascent of Zeboim. This is a World War I photo from the Holy Land. A bunch of German troops on the march. To me, it kind of gives the flavor of this. A group of armed men marching toward their destination, their goal. And of course you can see the kids running alongside, whooping it up. And that's probably accurate. Kids like to do that kind of thing. Okay. Verse 14. Came about when the king of Ai saw it, that the men of the city hurried and rose up early and went out to meet Israel in battle, he and all his people, at the appointed place before the desert plain. But he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. Joshua and all the people pretended to be beaten before them and fled by the way of the wilderness. And all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them. And they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. So, not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who had not gone out after Israel. And they left the city unguarded and pursued Israel. So, here is an aerial view, and what I'm going to do here is kind of follow this battle as they move. So, we've got this yellow line coming up where the Israelites follow the route up onto this ridge and encamp there for the night. You can see Ai off to their south. It's actually... This ridge is not directly north of Ai. If you go directly north from Ai, you're going up here. This is northeast. Hebrew does not have a term for northeast. It has north, east, south, and west. Those are the only directions in Hebrew. So it makes sense. How do you describe it then? If it's off of the cardinal point, it's north. It's as close as they get. They didn't have another word for it. They didn't combine words northeast, southwest like we do. Okay, so they are up there. A part of the military that's at Ai comes out across the valley to confront them. Apparently, at the first, some stayed back in the city just in case. What happened? Well, the Israelites feigned retreat. So the men of Ai were like, okay, we're doing this once and for all. We're going to whoop these guys. Call out the rest of the city. Come on, let's take them. Let's finish this. And so Israel retreats down the ridge with the men of Ai in hot pursuit. And guess what? There's an ambush force just waiting for them to empty the city. Fascinating point in there is that this also included the men of Bethel. Now, there's no indication of when the men of Bethel joined them. Bethel is a mile and a half to the west? You can't actually see Ai from Bethel because there's a rise in the ground. There's a hill on the other side that blocks the view. Wouldn't have been hard to send a messenger. We don't know if the men of Bethel had joined the men of Ai early on or if they came around this time. If they came around this time, so we've got the ambushers down in this Wadi Shaban, there's a saddle that goes right around here where you don't really have to go down into that wadi. There's a rise up here. And so they would have had to walk around the north end of the wadi to get to Ai. Theoretically, they could have looked down the wadi and seen, what are those guys doing? Today, it would be real easy to see. On the other hand, if this was forested at the time, you wouldn't have been able to see anything unless they had cook fires going and smoke coming up and, making their presence very obvious. But this included people both from Bethel and from Ai. Okay, verse 18. Let's see, I had one more I wanted to show you. And that includes the people coming from Bethel. Whether they came at that time or had been there for a little while is uncertain. Verse 18, Joshua chapter 8. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Stretch out the javelin that's in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand." So Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. When you think of a javelin, you usually think of a throwing spear. That's typically what the word means, as opposed to a heavy spear that you just thrust with. A javelin is typically one that can be thrown. Do we have any other translations here other than javelin? Sword. Okay. And there's reason for that. The Dead Sea Scrolls, this word is used in a context where it's also described as only being a couple of feet long. Well, who's going to throw a javelin that's a couple of feet long? And so a number of commentators have said, oh, okay, javelin's probably not the best word here. It's more likely to be a sword because it's fairly short. Do what you want with that. This is a sword from approximately that time period, and this is what most of the swords looked like. You can tell this sword is not intended for thrusting or piercing. It's meant for slashing. It's got a long, curved, sharpened edge, and that's typical of. They refer to them as sickle swords, for obvious reasons, right? If you've ever used a sickle to mow grass, or my kids did all kinds of things with those. It wasn't just grass. We won't get into that. So verse 19, the men in ambush arose quickly from their place, and when he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it. And they quickly set the city on fire. Did you pick up the timing sequence in there? What prompted the ambushers to attack? It seems that way, doesn't it? It's not stated real explicitly, but it sure sounds like that was a signal. He raised something, and they could see him and knew it was time to attack. He was standing in a place where he could be seen. Yeah. That's a good question. We are about 3/4 of a mile from the edge of the Wadi Shaban to where he's at. That's not too different from our parking lot to the hill right before you go over the tracks over there at Manly, if that helps you visualize it. A guy's pretty small at that distance, but visible. Maybe it depends on your eyes and if your glasses are clean or not. I've wondered if he didn't, have something with a flag on it or something to make it a little more visible. Or maybe he just had a scout up there that had eagle eyes and could tell. There's people that can really see well still. You can see on here I've got elevations. So Joshua's camp at the middle bottom is at an elevation of 2855. The valley floor is 100 feet lower. Ai is back up about the same height as Joshua's camp. The edge of the Wadi Shaban back there is another 100 feet higher. So if there was a scout, or maybe even a larger force, up on that spot, he could have seen Joshua. One of the fun things about Google Earth is that you can draw a line and it'll create an elevation map for you. So I did that. And this is what they told me. You can see the line that goes through I wanted to show you how deep this was, that goes through the Wadi Shaban up to the location where the scout could have been, which is right here. Here's the city of Ai, which is, you can see the heavier line here, that's this area. And then Joshua's camp out here. And sure enough, there's a direct line of sight from one to the other, even over a city. So again, the geography here just fits beautifully. I will admit that's a fair distance to see, but it doesn't strike me as impossible either. So they had set their ambush, then they attacked the city from the western side. Verse 20, Joshua 8 and verse 20. When the men of Ai turned back and looked, behold, the smoke of the city ascended to the sky, and they had no place to flee this way or that. For the people who had been fleeing to the wilderness turned against the pursuers. When Joshua and all Israel saw that the men in ambush had captured the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended, then they turned back and slew the men of Ai. This is purely by coincidence that the photographer, Bill Schlegel, who had his drone up taking photographs of Etel, which is nearby, caught a fire off in the distance, big old black smoky fire. But it kind of gives you a sense, I think, for what would light in a city. Wood, hay, but pretty good likelihood there would also be olive oil. This is the area where that kind of thing is produced. And you get a good oil fire burning, and you'll get some smoke. And of course, these guys turned around and could see that. Let me show you one other. From the early 1900s, there were some riots down here at the village of Artouf, and the city was on fire. But it's just reminiscent to me again of the city's on fire, they turn around and immediately can see that. And they had no place to run. And it was at that very moment that the fleeing main force turned around and enveloped them. And then Israelites from the ambush party did as well, and just completely cut the men of Ai off from any escape. Verse 22, the others came out of the city to encounter them. Those were the Israelite ambushers, so that they were trapped in the midst of Israel, some on this side, some on that side. And they slew them until no one was left of those who survived or escaped. But they took alive the king of Ai and brought him to Joshua, presumably bound, right? Oh, maybe just at gunpoint, sword point, whatever. Verse 24, now it came about when Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the wilderness where they pursued them, and all of them were fallen by the edge of the sword until they were destroyed. Then all Israel returned to Ai and struck it with the edge of the sword. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. Got to keep up with my notes here. I showed you already a sword similar to this. Sickle swords were the common sword during this time. I think it helps to explain this statement. They struck the city, the inhabitants, with the edge of the sword. That's literally how they used these. They weren't poking people. They were slashing. Just a couple of things here. My New American Standard says that there were 12,000 who fell. I have mentioned this numerous times before. The word that's translated here as thousand, aleph, has a number of different possibilities. It can also refer to a a military cohort, a group of soldiers. It can refer to a military commander, and it can refer to more of a tribe or clan. And it can refer to the number 1,000. My personal conviction on this is that translating it here as 1,000 is probably incorrect. I conferred with a guy that Doug here, he's at Associates of Biblical Research on this as well, and he agreed. This site is only 2.5 acres. Let me give you some numbers. Archaeologists estimate about 200 people per acre for cities in this period. So if the site's 2.5 acres, you'd expect about 500 people living there. Even if you double that because of an influx of people from from Bethel, you're still at 1,000. Double it again, you might be at 2,000. Um, if there were actually 12,000 people living here, that's 4,800 people per acre. That's a lot of people. It's going to be pretty crowded. For a population of 12,000, you'd expect a city of at least 60 acres. And there's one city that I know of that was, in fact, bigger than that, Hatzor. So it's not impossible to have a city that size, but this city, if we've got anywhere close to the right location, was not near that size. And in fact, the spies who went up there said the same thing. It's a small city. There's not much there.
How does the historical use of numbers in Hebrew language where 12 was considered a number that shows completeness? How does that change?
Could 12 have been a number of completeness? It's possible. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Completely decimated. Yeah. My gut is that the correct thing here is 12 military units, 12 cohorts, but I could be wrong on that too. I told you that archaeologists estimate about 200 people an acre for cities in this time. The most densely populated modern city today, by far, is Manila in the Philippines. It has 168 people per acre. So to suggest that 200 is too small of a number, I'm like, that's a lot of people to get in an acre, living in an acre. So I just say that, I guess, point this out because my mind wants to track it down and what's up with this number. If you're more comfortable with just saying, hey, it says 12,000 in my English version, so I'm going with 12,000, that's fine. I won't argue with you. Yes, that's also true. There may have been less than what we consider the number 30,000 to be in the Israelite group as well. Mm-hmm. 30 military units, it could have been. I didn't bring that up earlier because I figured I'd come to it eventually, but yeah. These are difficult things, and the last thing I want to do is undermine your confidence in Scripture, because I think Scripture here is correct. To me, the question is, have we translated it correctly? Have we understood what it's telling us? And I think there's a few options on how this word can be understood. So, counting livestock. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe there's more options even than what I've tried to present you with. So, yeah. Sorry, I'm running out of time here, but I'm almost done. Am I down to verse 28 already? I think so. Oh, 26, thank you. Joshua did not withdraw his hand, which he had stretched out with the javelin, until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Israel took only the cattle and the spoil of that city as plunder for themselves, according to the word of the Lord which he had commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation until this day. So by the day that the author of this book lived in, it still had not been re-inhabited. Verse 29, he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening, and at sunset Joshua gave command, and they took his body down from the tree, threw it at the entrance of the city gate, and raised over it a great heap of stones that stands to this day. And I'm going to stop there because we have a major shift with verse 30, which is its own fun thing. Okay, so there's a little more I could tell you there on the hanging thing, but I'm going to let that go for now. Points to ponder. This account is quite specific geographically, and the way it matches the actual site demonstrates that the author knew the location and described it accurately. I just love stuff like this because it demonstrates to me this is not just a made-up account, a fairy tale, somebody's, oh, wouldn't it be cool if so-and-so attacked such and such. This author knew the region, the area he was talking about, this area and specifically, described it very accurately, and it all fits. To me, that's encouraging. And you might consider this kind of an odd point, but God didn't continue to hold a grudge. Once the Achan issue had been dealt with, the slate was clean, he returned to fighting for Israel. I'm impressed by that. God didn't say, done with you guys. You had that Achan dude, so you're on your own now. No, they dealt with the sin, and then they were good. And God fought for the Israelites, delivered this place into their hand, just like he said. I don't think it's an accident that we don't hear of a single Israelite casualty here. We heard that there were 36 the time before. Here, nothing. And so I would take from that there actually were no Israelite casualties from this battle. But the men of Ai, Bethel, and all the people of the city were destroyed. Good. Any last minute questions? What's for lunch? Not that question, Daniel. Good enough. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, very, very unusual. We know that from all kinds of experience in different wars. Yeah. Even with our modern military technology, we still lose guys in battle. So, yeah. Okay, next week, totally different theme because Joshua and the Israelites are going to go up and renew the covenant at Mount Ebal by Shechem. And I think we've actually found remnant of that altar that he set up there. If you've never dug into that at all, it's pretty cool. So we'll get to that next week. Let me close this in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for your word. We're encouraged to see how you planned and fought for your people, how you gave them the victory after they had turned to you and dealt with their sin. Help us in our own personal lives to be quick to turn to you, to confess our sin, and we know that you will forgive. We know that you take care of us too, like you took care of the Israelites here. So help us to be faithful to you, to place our trust in your goodness and kindness, and we look forward to being with you one day and being like you. In your name I pray. Amen.